before long, the war was getting worse. We were doing worse in the war. I was going to be drafted. And I didn't want to be drafted into the infantry because they were going straight to Korea. And so several of us enlisted in the United States Air Force to avoid the infantry. And I enlisted in January of 1950 and was immediately shipped to Lackland down in San Antonio, Texas, Lackland Air Force Base. From there, I was shipped up to Wichita Falls, Texas, to Shepherd Air Force Base. And there, because of my limited IBM experience, they put me in an IBM machine records unit where I got to work on IBM machines and began to learn some things. I have a feeling the IBM people back in Chicago were absolutely delighted that I joined the Air Force because they didn't really like having people around who were in the bottom of the class. At this point in time, and this is something I've never been that particularly proud about, my father got a little over enthusiastic, and he used his pull to have me transferred from Wichita Falls, Texas, Shepherd Air Force Base, to Scott Field, which was right near St. Louis, where he and Mother lived by that time. They'd moved from Scarsdale. And I was transferred there, and because the IBM people, who were very helpful to the Air Force, helped arrange my being transferred there. And I worked in systems work there, writing procedures, and generally was learning a little bit more about the IBM equipment. But one day I was working on a report and I made a mistake. And I don't know how I did it, but I produced some bad figures. And I just didn't know what to do. And I did what I should have done. I went in to see the colonel. His name was Colonel Fryer. I said, Colonel, I've screwed something up. I've made mistakes. Here's what it is. And I said, appreciate it. He said, now, McKittrick, do you know how you made the mistake? I said, yes, sir. Are you going to make it again? No, sir. You sure? Yes, sir. That's all there is. Out. And again, talk about lesson learned. You know, if you make a mistake, own up to it, fix it, admit it, don't hide it. And I was so glad I did. And I'll always remember Colonel Fryer and how kind he was. While I was there, I was by this time an airman first class in the Air Force. That meant you had 3 little stripes and a few more bucks. I was very fortunate in being selected to be Airman of the Year for Scott Air Force Base. And you can see a picture here of me with the 2 commanding generals. And I was very, very proud of that particular thing. Don't know how they picked me. I think they picked me because I would cause less harm when I was with the general than some of the other people who weren't as comfortable being with generals. Meanwhile, I mentioned that I'd started with a fellow named Norton Booth. He'd gone off and sent to Europe, and he discovered a regulation in the Air Force that allowed a person with a college degree and 6 months experience to get a direct commission as second lieutenant in the field of statistical services and machine records units. Those are the units that used IBM machines to keep records for the military. So I applied for this, and it eventually came through, and I was made a second lieutenant. One day I was airman first class, saluting all the officers. The next day, I was a second lieutenant, and they transferred me immediately to Selfridge Field, Michigan, Mount Clemens, Michigan, outside Detroit, where I was put at the age of 21, 22 maybe, in charge of an IBM machine records unit that had 80 people in it and ran 3 shifts. And that was a very, very good learning experience. Selfridge Air Force Base was a large Air Force base. It was headquarters of the Air Force Reserve. It was a great experience, just a great experience. The IBM Machine Records unit that I was in, where the Air Force rented the equipment from IBM to keep records, kept records on all the several million Air Force reservists around the world. And we had a large contingent of equipment, went 3 shifts. The average age of most of the young enlisted people were low 20s or the high teens. We had some sergeants that were in their 30s and 40s. I was by far the youngest. And as I said, I was the youngest on the base. And as a result, you know, the Air Force, if you're the youngest guy on the base and the newest, they give you some little extra duties. And my extra duty was that I was Class 6 officer. And that meant that I would buy case whiskey from the big whiskey companies at heavy discounts, keep it in my quarters, beautiful BOQ called Bachelor's Officer Quarters, and then sell it to the officers. And the Air Force people are big drinkers. And at first I thought, what an imposition. And then I realized these colonels and majors and generals' wives are all calling me up, coming and asking me to deliver their bottles and collecting the money. So I got to know people. Instead of being just Lieutenant McKittrick, I was Lieutenant McKittrick that had the booze. And I barely drank in those days. The officers I worked for were really outstanding. Captain Putnam, my immediate boss, was the kind of a person who, if there'd be a complicated problem in a complicated report, he could roll up his sleeves and dig in the detail and find out what the problem was. He used to always have an expression. He says, always audit for sense. Don't just audit for totals. Does it make sense? S-E-N-S-E. Does it make sense? And then through Captain Putnam, I reported to Colonel Rodabaugh, who was a wonderful man and was very, very good to me, and I learned a lot from him. And Colonel Rodabaugh, I noticed, was not in his office all the time. And one time he confided, he says, you know, headquarters is a block away, the big brick building where all the generals are. And he says, we're here in this beat up old barracks, the statistical unit and the financial unit. He said, but I go over there so that they know I'm here, they know we're here, I find out what they're doing, and it's not we and they, I'm part of their team. And I remembered that. And later on, when I was in Washington reporting to Armonk, that bit of knowledge became very, very, very handy, is how to deal with the headquarters in another city. And I learned a lot from that. We had a great life. We had a golf course. We played golf constantly. We had parties. The officers' club, we'd have steak for $1. You'd have a steak dinner in the evening. The drinks were cheap, and it was a good life. My father's brother, Jim McKittrick, lived in Detroit, Michigan, and I would go down and see him. And my grandmother McKittrick was still alive, and I would drive down and see her. So I had some relatives I could visit as well. I also had roommates in the bachelor officers' quarters. We had two big bedrooms, a bathroom, private bathroom, and then a huge living room with a fireplace. And I roomed with 3 F-86 pilots. They flew, that was the plane we were using in Korea against the Russian MiG, which the South Koreans had and the Chinese had. And we might have breakfast in the morning over in the dining room across the way. And then in the evening, when we went back to the club, they would be there, but they had flown to Florida during the day and back. And they, incidentally, they kind of made fun because I was an office worker and they were real fighters. They were what the Air Force is really about, not keeping records, but fighting in the air. And they called me a titless waif because there was a woman's Air Force as well as the men's Air Force. They're part together, but they were separate in those days. And since I worked in an office, they considered me not a fighter, so they called me a titless waif. I learned a great deal, though, also about how to deal with a huge hierarchy, how to deal with a maze. You know what a maze is, a very complicated thing, usually hedges out in the garden, difficult to get through. Well, a huge bureaucracy. Here, you know, the Air Force had millions of people, and layer after layer after layer. Some of them absolutely outstanding, and some of them sleep at the switch. And just that short time as an officer, I learned how to cope, how to deal with this, figure out who was important, who wasn't, who could do this, who couldn't. It was a great learning experience. They also sent me to a leadership school, and I look back on the Air Force experience from 1950 to late 1953 as some of the most profitable and happy days of my life. Strongly recommend it, and I really feel that the idea, such as Israel has, of having all young men and women go into either the military or some form of public service for 2 years before college is a terrific idea.